And
was Dr. Rodin, maybe?
And I believe Judith Rodin is going to come up to the stage as well. Thank you, Judith.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm Michael Berkowitz with 100 Resilient Cities. 100 RC is the Rockefeller Foundation's $100 million commitment to build urban resilience worldwide. I'm very excited for this session, not just because I get to share the stage with my boss, but that is exciting, but also because we're going to announce the next cohort of cities, and it really culminates a 6-month process of working through all these applications. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rodin in a moment, and for the moment we've all been waiting for. But first I want to give you a short overview of what 100 RC does and the progress we've made in the year to date. First, maybe just to go back to the question that Charles asked and to reemphasize something that Dr. Rodin talked about in her opening remarks, that we take a very broad view of what resilience is. It's a city's, an urban resilience here is really a city's ability not just to bounce back and survive, but in fact to grow and thrive in the face of both chronic stresses and acute shocks. So both pervasive events like food, water, and energy shortages, things we call stresses, and acute shocks like disasters, flooding, earthquake, hazardous materials accidents, and so on. And we take a very broad, holistic view to Charles's question about what it's not. You know, it's hard to, in some ways, it's so broad and so holistic that we about what cities need to do to be truly resilient. It's not just emergency response and public health, although given my background in emergency services, I can tell you that's important. But it's things like broad and diverse economies. It's things like cohesive communities to the extent that neighbors check on neighbors. It's things like the fair and equitable administration of law and justice. It's good stewardship of infrastructure, both the built environment, and we have Mike Gilguli from Christchurch, a city that was impacted by seismic events, but also the natural environment. And Donald mentioned the mangroves, but where we also see instances where cities are deforest the hillsides. Above the cities, the rains come, the mudslides impact the cities, and so good stewardship of the environment is absolutely essential to resilience. And finally, it's about the integrated and synced up and joined up leadership with powerful and informed stakeholders. And so all of those things are things that make cities resilient. And we take that very broad view. We see two main challenges for cities' resilience building, and there are certainly others, but we're trying to solve for two in particular. And one is that cities are, and when I say cities here, I'm not talking about municipal governments. I'm talking about the entire ecosystems that are cities. Cities are incredibly complex ecosystems with a number of different stakeholders in civil society, in the private sector, across the different levels of government. And this makes getting aligned on what the next steps are, what the key priorities are, what initiatives are challenging. The second challenge is that solutions don't often don't scale quite efficiently enough, that cities too often reinvent the wheel one way or another. They don't access the funding that's out there efficiently. They don't use new tools because either they're not aware of them or they don't think they're applicable in their cities. And they don't share best practice effectively enough. And that comes at a cost. And so what we're doing is selecting 100 cities over the next over 3 years starting in 2013 and really offering 4 interventions to address those two challenges. The first is funding to hire a chief resilience officer, a senior person in municipal government with the breadth and scope to look across the sectors and the silos and really coordinate and advocate on behalf of the resilience issues. The second is to provide technical assistance and funding to create a resilience strategy. Think about this as a sort of 6 to 9 month process where cities look at what their risks and hazards are, what they do well and they don't, what their existing priorities are, to come up with what are some key goals and priorities and initiatives to support those priorities to build resilience. The third is an access to a platform of services and resources that cities can tap into. These are funding opportunities, best practice, technical assistance, and so on, a real curated list, and we'll talk a little bit, Judy mentioned it earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. Things that cities can more effectively tap into to scale solutioning. And finally, membership into a peer-to-peer network for the CROs so they can share best practice. And if you think about it, these first two interventions, funding to hire a chief resilience officer and technical assistance to create a strategy, try to solve for the complexity. You get a senior single point of contact, you get a rigorous planning project that lays out what the initiatives and priorities are, and that should help inform and catalyze the market generally to support cities to enhance their resilience. The second two, this access to a curated platform and access to a peer-to-peer network, try to help cities better leverage things that are working and avoid things that aren't. So what I'd like to do now is just quickly give you an update on the progress we've made across these four core offerings. It was exactly a year ago to date that we named our first 32 cities. And we've made some really interesting progress. I think we know that the challenge of building urban resilience is not going to be an easy or a quick one. It's going to be a multi-year, perhaps even a multi-generational struggle to really change the characteristics that make cities resilient or not. But we've been really heartened and inspired by some of the progress that has been made over this first year of 100 Resilient Cities. We've announced 19 CROs, and we have another 6 identified, and they've been already hard at work. Some of them are in fact here today, hard at work at advancing the resilience agenda. This strategy process I mentioned has been launched in 11 cities, and many more set for the first quarter. We have 27 partners on the platform, and Dr. Rodin's actually going to announce an additional cohort. And these partners have committed in excess of $100 million in additional funding to help support and services to help support cities. So really helping to leverage our dollars. These partners include Palantir, as Dr. Rodin talked about in her opening remarks, Swiss Re, which actually, to Donald's point, is advising cities on parametric insurance and similar issues. Veolia, the big infrastructure company, government agencies like the US EPA and Sandia National Labs, and NGOs, nonprofit NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and others. And finally, with respect to the network, I think it's fair to say that when we thought about the network and we thought about the diversity of these cities, we weren't sure that they would have enough to share. And because you have big cities like Rio and Mexico City and New York, and you have small cities like Byblos, Lebanon, and Vejle, Denmark, and Ramallah, Palestine. And what we found, and you have capacity ranges and different kinds of hazards that they're threatened with. But what we've really found is that there are amazing synergies and connections and lessons that can be learned across this diverse range of cities. And we just had our first CRO summit in New Orleans the first week in November with 25 CROs. And the learning already, the sharing across this network has been incredibly powerful and inspiring. And so with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Rodin up to make the announcement of the cities.
Thanks, Michael. It has been great progress, and I'd like to especially call out the 100 Resilient Cities team, because what you've been doing has been globe-trotting as these cities have unfolded in a way that is unimaginable. And call out the mayors who are here and the CROs and the platform partners, because many of you are in this journey with us right from the start. And it's been a remarkable one, it really has. So I want to congratulate all of you. As Michael said, it's also a pleasure not only to announce the new cities, but to announce the newest group of platform partners. And we continue to add platform partners over the course of the year, although we do our city announcement only once a year. So we'd like to welcome at this meeting our newest platform partners include Microsoft, whose global and security strategy and diplomacy team will provide cities with a set of cybersecurity indicators and work with cities to create a custom action plan to strengthen and secure their information systems and their infrastructure, critical, obviously, to building resilience against the rise of cyber attacks in our cities and all the institutions in the cities. CSIRO, an Australian research organization, which will provide future climate projections and tools tailored to cities' needs for urban planning, building infrastructure design and development. The Population and Community Development Association will provide Southeast Asian cities with resources for family planning, sexual health, and youth leadership training, among others. And finally, the new Starlight Foundation's construction company, which will provide financing for capacity building and collaboration around resilient infrastructure among public sector, academia, the private sector, and civil society. So you can see just in these the diversity of goods and services being provided to these cities, which is one of the amazing things that we've seen. I should also mention in response to one of Don's comments that one of the participants on the platform is the World Bank, and what they're actually providing to cities that don't have bond ratings is boot camps on how to become creditworthy to receive bond financing as those markets start to evolve and mature. So it will provide the infrastructure as well as access to the financing for these cities where there's a less mature market around municipal financing in particular. You know, when we first launched this challenge on our centennial, we had no idea what the ideal application was going to look like or what the judges would find it to be. And that was by design. We really wanted to learn, and we wanted the cities to speak for themselves, to reflect on their greatest needs and their most important assets, and whether they were willing to come together to seek shared solutions, to learn together, to share best practices. And we were thrilled last year by the amount of interest we received. And we had an amazing group in our first cohort. And as I said, the 100 Resilient Cities team has really, over this year, logged hundreds of thousands of air miles, and we have seen so much progress, and we've learned so much. Needs were identified, ideas emerged, plans took shape, chief resilience officers were hired and took their places in so many interesting ways. In many city governments, we saw that government actually reorganized itself in a way that enabled the CRO to have cross-functional power in city government to integrate in ways that the government simply had not done before. CROs also got to work engaging community members, the private sector, and others. But we saw something that was incredibly exciting and that we didn't expect to take off quite as quickly. And that is what is happening naturally among and between the cities themselves. So Medellin is tapping seismic expertise in San Francisco and Christchurch to prepare for what they think is an inevitable high-magnitude earthquake. New Orleans is working with Rotterdam to better understand how to live with water. Mexico City, Rio, Bangkok, and New York are collaborating to grapple with issues of growth, water management, and inequality in really interesting ways as a result of partnering through the 100 Resilient Cities network. And so when we opened the second round of challenges, we knew we wanted cities that were not only committed to their own deep work, but actually, now that we've seen this evolve, We wanted cities that were equally enthusiastic about learning from one another and engaging one another, because we've seen the power in that, and we were really not at all disappointed. We were thrilled. More than 80% of the 330 applications we received indicated excitement to partner with other cities in their resilience efforts. Applications were equally amazing in their diversity and scope. They represented 90 countries on 6 continents, with populations ranging from 50,000 to well over 10 million. Applications were written in 7 different languages, and notably 70% came from the developing world. Once again, we faced a very tough decision, and working once again with a distinguished panel of judges, a final winning group of 35 cities emerged. So 35 cities out of 330 quite strong applications. So I'd like to announce the cities. I feel like I'm at the Oscars. In alphabetical order, the newest cities we welcome to the 100 Resilient Cities Network are Accra, Ghana, Amman, Jordan, Arusha, Tanzania, I want to make sure I'm not going too fast, Athens, Greece, Barcelona, Spain, Belgrade, Serbia, Bengaluru, India, Boston, United States, Cali, Colombia, Chennai, India, Chicago, United States, Dallas, United States, Dayang, China, Enugu, Nigeria, Huangqi, China, Juarez, Mexico, Kigali, Rwanda, Lisbon, Portugal, London, United Kingdom, Milan, Italy, Montreal, Canada, Paris, France, Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Pittsburgh, United States, San Juan, United States,
We're a couple behind you.
oh, I'll wait for San Juan. The graphics are so great. Santa Fe, Argentina, Santiago de los Caballeros, Dominican Republic, Santiago, Chile, Singapore,
Hey.
St. Louis, United States, Sydney, Australia, Thessaloniki, Greece. Toyama, Japan.
Hey.
Tulsa, United States. Wellington City, New Zealand. With the addition of the cities just announced, 1/5 of the world's urban population, that's 700 million people, now lives in a city that's part of the 100 Resilient Cities network. And we're not done yet. Next year, we'll announce the final group of cities to bring the total to 100. But for these cities just announced today, the work begins, and we can't wait to get started. So, Michael, let's talk about some of the things we learned from these cities.
Great. Great. Looking at all those wonderful shots, you tend to forget that these cities actually have issues. I mean, they're really just gorgeous places to go visit.
Exactly. And I know you can't wait.
That's right. But you've had a chance to read all of these applications, and in fact, many more from the short list. What were some of the themes that jumped out at you?
One thing that was striking, and I'm sure everyone in the group saw this, we saw in this set of applications a large group of what we would consider urban pioneers. Barcelona is seen as an urban pioneer. Singapore, obviously, London.
Yeah.
And so it demonstrated, I think, very clearly, and their applications were incredibly interesting, that even those that we think are more evolved and further along on this journey recognize that there's still so much more work to be done, and that solutions that they developed, because they were really leaders, in an earlier period of time, maybe solutions that are challenged now and need refreshing and rethinking given a new set of 21st century realities. So I think that was very compelling. But we also saw cities in this applicant pool who were raising very different issues and clearly were thinking about this deeply, even though we wouldn't think of them as evolved as a Singapore or a Barcelona in their resilience planning. So Juarez, for example, had an amazing application and saw the opportunity. El Paso is in the first cohort, and Juarez wrote really compellingly about what a cross-border collaboration could mean, because so many of their challenges are really one another, not only one another's challenges, but they are challenging one another as cities in some profound ways, and they know it. So using them as a really interesting model for what regional collaboration cross-border should look and feel like, we think is incredibly interesting. Dallas.
Can I just say there? I mean, that is something that we hear all the time from almost every city, is that the mayors themselves control, and we just talked at length with the Athens mayor yesterday about this, that mayors control only a piece of their destiny. Yeah. That it's a real regional, these issues are regional, whether they're flood control issues, whether they're public health, whether they're economic development issues. All of these span the municipal government's authority and really are much broader than that. So as you mentioned, looking really explicitly at El Paso and Juarez is one interesting way. The other thing we should point out is that in the first cohort we named the Bay Area as a regional cohort to try to think about these issues. But in every city we're really pushing the CRO to think about these things more broadly.
But you mentioned the Bay Area in the first. I think it's really notable that the Bay Area cities all applied separately. And we asked them to collaborate and create a regional approach to this, which to us seemed like sort of 101 thinking, and yet wasn't what we were seeing in the application process. And it has in some ways been difficult. It's been easy and great in some ways for them, And in some ways it's been difficult. They're not organized in ways that allow them to collaborate. In some ways it's been easier for San Francisco and Christchurch to collaborate around seismic risk than for San Francisco and Oakland to collaborate around their own regional pressures. So this is one of the interesting things that we really are seeing and that I think we're working through.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that I was thinking when you were talking about Singapore, London, and Barcelona, one of the things we often get asked is, Singapore, they don't need your help. Why are they here? Or London? And this was in the first cohort with New York and cities like Rotterdam. And as you mentioned, one of the reasons we like to have a mix of capacity cities in this network is so that the sharing can go in multi-directional ways. But I think the other thing to point out is that one of the things that you're holding us accountable to is that not just that we change 100 cities, but that we influence and change many more. There are 10,000 some odd cities in the world, right? So 100 is just a small drop in the bucket. What we're trying to do is to influence a number of different, and have copy. One of the metrics that we're measuring ourselves is when is the first city who's not in the network going to hire their CRO and do a resilience strategy, right? So that's one of the reasons why cities like London, Singapore, Barcelona are so important in this network.
And we see even spontaneously, I think, mayors and chief resilience officers acting as ambassadors and proselytizers to other cities not in the network. So even in the first round, the mayor of Byblos, Lebanon, invited to the first convening, we call that the agenda setting workshop, that each city holds for all of their stakeholders as this process gets started. He invited 3 other mayors. He invited all of the generals in the national government, which sort of startled us, but he wanted them to start thinking about how resilience should be expressed in terms of national security and use that framing. And there are a lot of countries now thinking about their own national security in different ways through this resilience lens. So we're seeing all kinds of sort of epiphenomenon popping up that aren't related specifically to those cities. Michael, one other thing we saw in this round was cities really articulating some very immediate and extraordinary stresses and pressures, and we didn't shy away from selecting those cities. So we chose St. Louis, which was extremely articulate in its application about the racial issues it's confronting as a result of the Ferguson decision and the need to really understand social and civil issues if they're going to make any progress as a city.
Yeah, I think that underscores Donald's point from the first panel. Is it me? Is it now? So we looked for cities that really understood the me and the now piece of this. And so, and that was a big lesson from, I think, the first cohort, is that cities that have had either recent crisis or are in the midst of under the strain of a significant stress are much more likely to change. And you talked about St. Louis. Athens is another that is facing a number of different social and economic and climate threats. Really is incredibly articulate about the intersection between those. And so that felt like a really good space to be in.
And maybe you could mention Amman. I was impressed by how they were confronting yet a different set of issues that were immediate.
Yeah, I mean, I was just last month in Amman, and it's one of the few really stable havens in a region that is racked by conflict, and the mayor sits me down and says to me, "What do you know about Amman?" And I say, "Well, I know Amman is growing because of this thing." He stops me. He says, "No, we're not growing. We're expanding, and there's a real difference." And that really struck us as one of the, it's a city that was only a few million people. It's over the last 10 years almost doubled in size. It's a real and the strains that put on the infrastructure, on the community cohesion, on a number of aspects there are really interesting.
I think several of the cities when we add the two cohorts together, are strained in refugee expanding population issues.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that they're beginning to think about together in terms of their response, because we've been we the world, dealing with it on such an immediate emergency relief kind of strategy, and yet the question is, how will or should the receiving cities integrate those refugees into their cities? And it's a profound and immediate issue for many of them.
Yeah. And related to that, although it's not necessarily refugees, but it is migrants, you see, as you mentioned in your opening, that Asia is this sort of intersection between massive and rapid urbanization and risk, is really one of the reasons why we felt so strongly about expanding into Asia.
And we have now many more Asian cities, so in that second cohort. So we've added, we didn't have Chinese cities in the first cohort, now adding 2 Chinese cities, 1 Japanese city. So terrific, adding Phnom Penh and Bangalore, Chennai. We had in the first cohort Bangkok, Mandalay, Da Nang, Surat, Semarang, and now of course Singapore. Yeah. So we're going to have a very good cohort of Asian cities. And to the issues that Don raised, it is ground zero, particularly for climate-related disasters. And so having that kind of experience and the kind of networking that will go on there, I think, will be extremely important and beneficial to the cities, beneficial for us in terms of learning. I mean, the luxury of all of this for us is that it is such continuous learning. We are evolving so much in our thinking through your experiences, and it's been, I think, one of the great pleasures of both learning from our work in New Orleans, in the post-Sandy recovery, in the Asian cities, Climate Change Resilience Network, and now in 100 Resilient Cities. So we have evolved.
Yeah. I think, you know, looking at the list of Asian cities, just one more thought about Asian cities. Looking at the list, you're really struck with the diversity of that list, right? And particularly governance. I mean, we had long discussions with many people in this room, Aramar and others, and Ashvin, about the Indian cities, who are notoriously disempowered in some ways, because power often rests at the state and at the national level. You know, we did choose 2 big southern Indian cities in Chennai and Bangalore, but Chennai, interestingly, has one of the few directly elected mayors, and so that will be interesting to see that. And on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have Singapore, which nicely has both city, municipal, and national governments sort of wrapped up in one, and so.
The one thing I would say about India, though, Michael, is that India is thinking about its own urban strategy, and with the anticipated development of so many new cities in India and a history and tradition of non-mayoral governance, we see a potential to influence how the Indian government thinks about municipal government authority as these new cities develop all over the country. And we've had some very good discussions both with the Singh government and now with the Modi government around potential efforts in that area. So this is really a prime moment, I think, as India is really retranslating its own thinking about municipal, whether or not to have municipal governments in any real way.
Yeah. I think it was interesting just thinking about over the 330 some odd applications that we saw, you know, the top shocks and stresses, many of them being related to climate. So just, you know, to the 3 top shocks that cities identified were flooding, earthquake, and infrastructure failure. And the 3 top stresses were aging infrastructure, drought and water shortage, and rising sea level and coastal erosion. So you can definitely see it's more diverse than climate, but certainly a strong thread of climate.
Definitely. And we also saw a recurring theme of water challenges, both too much and too little. And some cities that had both,
Yes.
too much and too little. Amman talked about both ends of that spectrum. Bangalore talked about facing severe water shortage, a city once known for having 1,400 lakes. Most of its potable water is now from far away, so a problem, and yet they flood during rainy seasons. So again, we saw this repeated theme. We often think about one city having too much and another too little, but cities are really experiencing both kinds of vulnerabilities. And yet we saw some leading edge, there's a American expression called canary in the coal mine, sort of what is a leading edge stressor that some of these applications we're talking about. So again, the very articulate and honest application from St. Louis about race and social unrest. London talked a lot about cybercrime and cybersecurity, and so and a great involvement in the application of their municipal police authority. So we'll have some really interesting leading edge thinking from their efforts that I know will benefit other cities as well.
You know, the race and inequity feels like it's one of the big challenges for resilience thinking over the next years. We see it in many different contexts in many different cities, both developed and developing. And it's one thing we talked to our CROs about in New Orleans a few weeks ago. Many of these CROs don't come naturally from that background. They come from other planning, emergency services. They come from different kinds of backgrounds. But the people who can get themselves comfortable with the equity agenda. Yeah. Because if you have a city that has a good understanding that isn't too inequitable, it can survive many things. But if you don't have that, who knows? Is it going to be a fruit vendor setting himself afire? Is it going to be police shooting the wrong, shooting someone in suspect circumstances? Is it going to be a blackout or an earthquake? If you don't have that kind of cohesion, then anything can set that off, and that's a real leading indicator for resilience.
And I talked about diversity and redundancy as being one characteristic of resilience. I meant more than redundant stuff. Diversity is also about different types of people and different points of view, and how that gets woven together into the fabric of a city to strengthen it rather than drive it apart, I think is a critical part of the work that the cities will be doing, and a lot of the cities clearly are thinking about that. Michael, let me switch and just ask you maybe one final question, and that is, this is so much focused on all the bad stuff that cities are worried about, and inevitably that's true, but didn't you also feel a lot of optimism and kind of in the applications? So many of the cities were really articulate about what they felt good about and what they had already accomplished.
Yeah, I think that's right. An application, even from a city like Kigali that had such an in-depth and nuanced understanding of resilience and the interdependencies around food supply, flooding, infrastructure robustness, social recovery, all of those issues being woven together, I think felt really good, and also our articulation of things that we don't usually think about. And I thought it was interesting that Donald raised aging. We saw aging from a couple of applications. Singapore talks about it often, and Toyama, Japan, obviously identified it as a key stress for them going forwards. And so thinking about both economic development and aging as key resilience drivers. This kind of broad thinking was really, really exciting to see, I think.
We also saw a lot of interesting discussion around already ongoing collaboration with the private sector. So Don, you talked about how the private sector is reaching in a variety of ways in the cities, and a lot of cities talked about how they were reaching out. So I mentioned in my remarks from the first cohort, we saw that in San Francisco. In this new cohort, we saw it in Sydney. Sydney has a Better Buildings partnership set up in 2011, a collaboration between the city and all the major commercial real estate companies in the city to work on sustainability of all of the built environment. It covers 54% of all of the built environment, and really a very compelling discussion in that application. London talked about how they're working with Palantir and with Cisco and the Metropolitan Police to pilot new kinds of technology around gang violence analytics, which is going to be so important in so many of these cities, and also how to work on predictive policing, again, with very encouraging results and results that will be shared with all the cities. The government of Santiago is in the process of institutionalizing and bringing together all the different business associations in the city. So just as we see fracturing in the siloed within city government, we see some fracturing of different business organizations in cities, and how all of that capacity is woven together and integrated is something Santiago's really talked about quite a lot, and other cities will benefit from that. And then Toyama has, of course, an amazing advantage in being named an environmental future city by the Japanese government, so it takes that designation, but it's doing it, and it received that designation because it's taking a compact sustainability approach to city development, and that's an incredible model. We have a lot of architecture schools and design schools around the world drawing theoretical models, and we find those really interesting. They're annual competitions that we see. Some of them we actually fund, but Toyama's actually on the ground doing it, and it will be, and working with their business sector across all of the sectors, and so that'll be a phenomenal way for other cities to learn.
Yeah, I think before we wrap up, we actually have 3 minutes. Maybe we could just throw it open for any quick questions that people have. Any questions? Back and then, or the other way. Possession of the mic is 7/10 of the law.
My name is Tony Morales. I'm the Philippine ambassador to Singapore. Well, I agree that there's a diversity in the cities that you mentioned. My question is, on the other end of the spectrum, the resiliency challenged cities, how do they benefit from this? Cities which I believe are chosen because they are already resilient in some ways. So on the other end of the spectrum, is there an initiative for them to benefit from the best practices of these resilient cities?
So we're just 1 year in, but one of the things that we absolutely will do in next year and in the out years is exactly what you're talking about. Figure ways to better share what is working and what isn't, and connect to larger networks. So I think that's one thing. Another, and Judy, I don't know if you want to talk about ACERN and the expansion, but we've just now expanded the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network to include another 40 cities and 10 from the Philippines. And we've been talking very closely with ACERN to make sure that as they stand up and their information sharing and knowledge management network, that we're able to plug in and do that. Because you're absolutely right that 67 is a lot of cities for a small organization, but for a global footprint of cities, it still doesn't cover everything.
We have the benefit also of having phenomenal partners that we've developed through ACERN's work, who are in many places around the world, Mercy Corps, ICLEI, ARUP, and others. And so that expanded network is part of the family, if you will, both for 100 Resilient Cities, but also for continuing to develop kind of concentric overlapping circles of influence around these issues. We are deeply in touch with the C40, and some of the cities in our network are C40 cities. What's different and perhaps unique about 100 RC is all these cities will be developing through a common framework, their set of activities. So the language they speak to one another, they will all understand where they came from, how they evolved through the strategy process, what what's going onto the platform is unique for these cities. That is the access to these now 30-some and more. We're still analyzing other offers of companies and entities for the platform is a way for these cities to really develop some shared practices and some shared understanding that then can evolve more widely beyond those cities.
Yeah. We're sorry, we only have time for one more. I've already blown through whatever extra time we had.
Chetin Karakush, BP. I have a question about the city governance structure. So on one hand, you try to empower the local authorities, municipal governments, so that they can, act in an agile fashion, get things done. On the other hand, especially in the developing world, you want kind of increased transparency to prevent, corruption. Yeah. So, do you have any kind of best practices, from your experience, so that that could be followed to strike the right balance between the centralization and decentralization? Yeah,
I think so. A couple of things, just very quickly. One is, you're absolutely right. One of the key tensions in this program is that on the one hand, we see resilience building as broad, decentralized across a number of different sectors. The attendance in this room is testament to that. That we know that it's not just government, not just municipal government, but in fact civil society and the private sector as well. And to the extent that we can integrate and leverage each other's resources is absolutely key. On the other hand, one of our name brand interventions is at the municipal government. We had to start somewhere, and we hired the Chief Resilience Officer. And so we're cognizant of those two tensions. So we do think that municipal governments and chief executives of municipal governments, mayors or governors, have real power and opportunity to shape the environments that they live in. So,
I would just add two things.
Yeah.
One, I should have mentioned Taro when I listed the phenomenal group of ACERN partners, so sorry. And secondly, this won't work unless there's bottoms-up governance as well. This is not just about municipal governance. So the community leadership, the civil society activity, and is really what is critical in making a fully resilient city. And we rejected applications that made it clear that they weren't willing or eager for that kind of partnership, or able to have that kind of partnership. So again, there was a lot in these applications that gave us pause.
So we're okay. Over time, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is that your pen?